Pleasure to be here, certainly. Probably saw some of you folks at IPPS meetings in Cincinnati, was it 2 years ago now, maybe Perennial Plant Association 3 years ago. I've been in Chicago Botanic Garden for 21 plus years as the Director of Ornamental Plant Research, fancy title. In short though, I'm the plant breeder there as well as head up the Chicagoland Grows Plant Introduction Program, which is actually what we're here to talk about today. So, and I'll keep talking while they're scurrying. I think we're good. And you can hear me in the back? Yeah, we're fine back there. All right. Well, here to talk about Chicagoland Grows, which you may or may not know. It's a small plant introduction program based in Upper Illinois, though our reach certainly extends beyond that. I do hang my hat at Chicago Botanic Garden. I do encourage you, if you haven't been there before and you happen to be way up at the other end of Illinois, northern Illinois, do come see us. It's a rather extensive and sizable botanic garden with about 88 acres of display gardens, 112 acre native wood lot, and around 100 or 80 to 100 acres of water as well. Quite the show garden. Ornamental plant research comprises basically three programs at the Botanic Garden. Two of us doing these three programs. The plant breeding, which is my work, and we'll get to that later in the talk. Richard Hockey heads up the plant evaluation program. I'm going to give Richard a bit of a brief shout out here in the presentation because I think it can be value to you down here even. And then of course we'll talk about Chicagoland Grows, the plant introduction program throughout. Richard Hockey has an old school comparative trials program. He's been running this for about 30 plus years now. It's old school, put the plants in the ground and compare them side by side, collect data on them, at the end of the day publish that data. Currently he's looking at about 700 taxa, mostly herbaceous perennials with a smattering of shrubs in there. Has done vines in the past as well until our trellis went away. That makes it a little challenging to do vines. And collects data typically for 5 years to try to even out those odd years. As somebody mentioned earlier, there hasn't been a regular year. And the information on these get published previously in printed form of these plant evaluation notes. These are all now electronically available from our website. I have the URL there in case you're interested. Publishes about 1 to 2 to 3 of these a year, kind of depending as he wraps up research projects. Also in the last, I think 4 years now, he's been writing 4 articles a year for Fine Gardening. Now if you read that publication at all, you've actually run into his evaluation results in those as well. So we need these kind of comparative trials throughout the country because it can be apples to oranges if people are too far afield from where we're headquartered to look at these evaluation results. We're zone 5 in northern Illinois. We're on a lovely flat, no rolling hills, bucolic rolling hills unfortunately. Flat alkaline clay soil, pH about 7.6. Our rain will average about 38 to 42 inches a year. So on average a little less than you, but in the time I've been there we've had anywhere from 28 to I think 65. So averages have to be taken with a grain of salt. Kind of a dual approach to both Richard and my research is that we really are, it's kind of a bottom up, we're focusing on individual plants. As a plant breeder, I may be breeding a lot of taxa, I may be looking at thousands of plants, but it's ultimately looking at any one plant out there that I'm potentially going to select for introduction. Similar for Richard, even though he's looking at those 700 taxa, it ultimately comes down to how each plant performs. And like the previous speakers, I'm up here waving a fly away, that's what the gesturing is about. But it's a top-down ethic, and that we want our plants to perform well in landscapes. We think of a landscape kind of like an ecosystem. We don't want to do harm. We want those plants to have all these positive attributes. And so as we are evaluating plants as well as we're breeding plants, we never spray, for instance, with fungicides or insecticides. We want to see what has disease and insect susceptibility and resistance and publish on that or utilize that in my breeding work accordingly. And so some years back, 3 years now, we wrapped up a miscanthus trial. Richard was just looking at, of course, all the ornamental attributes, how big they are, how hardy they are in zone 5, bloom time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, 31 different descriptors that he collects data on. But one of our graduate students looked at seed set. Now we created the perfect storm in that we had 55 cultivars of miscanthus. Like a lot of grasses, Miscanthus sinensis tends to be self-incompatible. It needs to cross-pollinate with another genotype of the same species to get seed set. And basically we found seed on everything. And the worst offender was producing on average 250,000 viable seed per plant. And by the end of this trial, that was a 7-year-old plant, which was good size, typical miscanthus. That's an awful lot of seed to dump into the landscape. And I'm sure these are appearing on our invasive species list in northern Illinois, so I'm sure it's a real problem through here. So at the end of the day, we ultimately didn't really recommend any of these cultivars. We don't want to be encouraging people adding these to the landscapes. And also you don't know, again, what that cross-compatibility might be. One of our low seed set ones, if you plant it with something that proves to be a good pollinator, it could become a big problem. So we don't recommend anything there. So we're really here to talk largely about Chicagoland Grows. This is our regional plant introduction program founded by Roy Taylor, one of the former directors of the Botanic Garden. And if you're really getting older like I am, you may remember Roy Taylor from the 70s when he was the director at University of British Columbia's Botanic Garden and actually initiated a plant introduction program there. So first and foremost, we're introducing plants for use in northern Illinois, but obviously if they're good there on our alkaline soils in Zone 5, they have applicability in a lot of other parts of the country, and indeed even around the world. Just some of the summary data where we're at this point. We basically really are a plant breeding program, and we'll talk about that as we go through it. And then we have to license nurseries both regionally as well as nationally, internationally, to do the heavy lifting. We'll provide a limited amount of stock plants because that's basically all we can do with our propagation facilities, and get them out into the trade as best we can, and let the licensees, as I say, do the heavy lifting of the propagation and the sales. 60 introductions to date, 25 from the garden, 22 from the Arboretum. It really has been a nice balance. 13 from other partners, though a lot of those are historic as the program was getting going. And kind of ironic too, as this program started 30 years ago, a lot of the nurseries up our way were still seed growing plants, like especially viburnums. And so it was easy to go out into the fields and make some selections of viburnum dentatum because they were seed growing them. Well, who seed grows? Are any of you guys seed growing any woody plants at this point? Yeah, one. Maybe for restoration purposes or local genotypes, or you just still are. Well, you can see it's a minority these days because we really depend on named cultivars and vegetative propagation. Ultimately, once we select plants, of course, we do propagate them. We use trademarks to protect the woody plants. We use patents to protect the herbaceous perennials, collect the royalty back, and that pays my bills, and I thank you for that. So I'd like to focus on the woody plants first because we really started with the woody plants in the program. And indeed, we didn't bring perennials on board till 12 years ago when I started breeding the perennials. And so we'll talk more about that. 22 trees and shrubs to date, 13 more that are kind of in nursery trials right now, where anywhere from we just sent the stock out last year and they haven't done anything with it, to trees that are actually being sold in very low numbers, but not enough of a feel, enough nurseries propagating them yet for us to really have a good feel for them. A lot of these came, most of these came from two sources. The Morton Arboretum's active breeding, which we'll talk about, and then their historic collections. How many of you have been to Morton Arboretum? Just a few of you. Certainly I encourage the woody plant people in the crowd that if you get a chance to go up to Morton Arboretum, certainly do so. It's one of the larger arboretum in the country at 1,500 acres. It's also reasonably historic. It's a little over 100 years old now, I guess, at this point. And the name Morton should ring a bell to you. Those little blue boxes of salt that you buy at the grocery store, it's one in the same family. They actually started Morton Arboretum as kind of a summer escape. Imagine a 1,500 acre escape from the rigors of the heat of downtown Chicago. But the family always had a history and an interest in trees. And in fact, the founder, Joy Morton, the founder of Morton Arboretum, his mother or his father, I'm a little garbled now, actually started Arbor Day a generation earlier over in Iowa before they moved over to the Chicago area. Dr. George Ware, who's unfortunately not with us anymore, but headed up research at the Morton Arboretum for, well, 30 years and then hung around as a retiree for another 10 years, really was instrumental in their breeding work. He was here. We heard the Dutch elm disease mentioned earlier this morning. I was kind of surprised as I was doing research on this a few days ago that Dutch elm disease actually rolled through this country 2 times in 2 different forms of the disease. And the second wave that came through as recently as the 60s, 70s is the one that really obliterated the rest of them from our landscapes. And so George recognized, and you're seeing this one tree by the Thornhill Center, that this one elm on the property was quite resistant. And so he started looking into that elm and figure out who exactly it was, and then started to use that in his breeding program. And so we've released a total of 5 hybrid elms from his work. We're still looking at some seedlings, hybrid seedlings of his, seedlings that are 20, 25 years old now, as well as he was very active in collecting elm trees in China and in Russia, and a number of those are still being evaluated for not only Dutch elm disease resistance, but also resistance to flea beetle and other issues that beset elm trees in the Midwest, and of course looking at them for their ornamental attributes. That certainly cannot be secondary to those. So we'll talk about some of the plants. This original plant, Accolade, which you probably know, it's been in the trade, it was actually received in 1924 as seed from Arnold Arboretum. Reputedly, it was almost Japonica, but molecular work indicates that it actually was a cross of Japonica and Wilsoniana, just natural hybrid. I'm not sure when the original plant was planted at the Arboretum, but out in 26 or 27 probably, and unfortunately is not with us now. And so that one was introduced in 2003. It's kind of interesting. Trees, for you non-tree people in the crowd, are slow to reach the marketplace and acceptance. We have some trees that we've distributed from Chicagoland Grows 10, 12 years ago that still are not readily available. Here we put out in 2003 and 2012, one of the SMA said, "Oh, this isn't a bad looking tree," after 12 years. So upright, it is a hybrid 2 Asian species, has proven completely resistant to Dutch elm disease, really gives you that American elm feel. It was a challenge when we first distributed this plant because people weren't growing American elms anymore and weren't used to how do you grow an elm. Some of these will put on 6, 7, 8 feet of growth a year. Putting them on 10-foot centers in the nursery won't work. You better be going 15 and 20-foot centers. And elm trees, for those of you who aren't familiar, also don't make a good leader. So it's really a real kind of rampant mop head, I call it, in its youth before it settles down to something that's more attractive. So here's one. George actually did distribute some to local municipalities very early on in his evaluation. And so there's some nice mature trees on some of the streets near the Arboretum. And a really large one on the property that they moved next to their science building, sulked for a couple years. But I've been having fun watching this building and taking pictures of it over the year. Great silhouette, wonderful tree. And so using Accolade, he did breeding. We used to joke back and forth because I was breeding those herbaceous things and he was breeding these big trees. And I asked George one year, how long between generations, maybe from seed to first bloom of an elm tree so you could use it again in breeding? He said, well, 20 to 25 years. I'm a patient kind of guy. Indeed, you have to be. So these other 4 are more or less in the trade, some more available than others, and I won't beat them all to death. The one that has kind of overtaken Accolade in sales is Triumph, and I think this is mainly because it's a little more refined habit, not quite as rampant of a grower, and so it performs better for the nurseries as they're dealing with it. Has this really nice glossy foliage to it as well, and of course it's got the disease resistance. And then Commendation is kind of a late coming on one. It's is probably going to be a really big one. We think it's going to be probably 50 to 60 feet tall by as wide. Also has the resistance. You can see the parentage there got a little more complicated before George wrapped things up. And this one has an excellent fall color. This outlay is actually at the Botanic Garden, and we put them in a really prominent location such that the visiting public can really enjoy them. So couple you can enjoy. More work from George where he actually developed a series of hybrid London plane trees. If you're not aware, these are crosses of our native sycamore with the Eurasian Platanus orientalis, and you get London plane trees. And the first one we introduced was this one, Exclamation, which has been really popular for frost tolerance, cold tolerance, anthracnose, and powdery mildew resistance. And it's really the only form in the marketplace. It's more an upright one than a spreader like Bloodgood. And so the sales of that have actually just absolutely exploded for us. It has a typical exfoliating bark, of course. Even at a young age, That one was probably about a 6-inch DBH, and you're already seeing nice bark on that. And the West Coast liner producers, the J. Frank Schmidts and Femrites, and JNPL actually is our biggest liner producer. I shouldn't go rattling off names without saying that. Really like it because it's been a very uniform grower, and so that's a field shot out on the West Coast. So, and then we had a sister seedling to that, Ovation, which was a broad-headed one out of the same cross, had the same hardiness and disease-resistant attributes, but this one simply proved difficult to propagate. And so, in fact, it proved so difficult to propagate that at one point we had kind of a jumping of the fence, and the stock of it at a crucial West Coast nursery become exclamation, not ovation, and they were selling the one and the same plant under 2 names. So we were a number of years straightening that out. You might still find some occasionally for sale, but I think it's probably dropping completely away. However, in recent years, kind of a side anecdote. So George Ware made this original cross. He planted out about 150 plants, my understanding, grew them on to about 5 or 6 years of age, and then selected on disease resistance at that point, and took the remaining 15, 20 saplings, and instead of planting them on the 1,500 acres, which I think the rest of us would have done, he distributed those directly to municipalities in the area. And so we've had to go off-site to find all his plants. Well, it was just 3 or 4 years ago that Chris Bachtel at the Morton Arboretum was going through George's notes and realized that a cemetery near the area actually had 6 of the plants planted out, which he didn't know, and he went and looked at. These are now 35 years old, and one of them was just really outstanding. That's the one you're looking at here. And this one's been very easy to propagate, so we think this one we'll put out there into the trade as well, which means taking cuttings this year, you'll see them in 10, but hang in there. Other introductions from the Morton Arboretum, they did a Freeman maple, Marmo. The nurserymen love this because it's a very easy one to grow, easy to propagate, good form, but fall color is unreliable, and so the 2 weeks of color versus the 5 months of good habit and good growth and ease of propagation has probably held it back some. This one has been a big seller for us, Acer Miyabi. It's an Asian species. It's a quite tolerant maple of both acid and alkaline soils and pollution and salts, and moderately drought tolerant for a maple, and it does not seed around like Norway maple, and so you can look at this one. Here's the original tree, and I wish I had somebody in scale, but if we had a person standing there, they'd be about yay. The original tree is about 55 feet tall now, and you might shudder and think that's getting a little big for urban landscapes. But this is about a 95-year-old tree now on the property. It's indeed one of their historic collections. Has picked up some awards along the way as well, which you can see here. Sometimes it's just kind of a chance thing. This Acer saccharum arose as a seedling at the Arboretum, and they actually had moved it into the parking lot from a hedgerow because it had such nice color. And it can also show how slow we've been, because you can see from the land barges how long ago we were evaluating this plant, probably in the 80s before I arrived. A bunch of groovy guys standing around, nurserymen, evaluating this plant. But we propagated and finally got it out, and it's proven to be a little more drought tolerant, a little more heat tolerant. Some of you may remember they used to consider kind of a Midwestern form of sugar maple, the black maple, with slightly over into Iowa, that has a little more drought tolerance, a little heavier leaf, and that seems to be in the blood of this one. So we just introduced that one a few years ago with some limited availability still. And then we've also gone afield to plants, not just natives but non-natives. This is another historic tree in their collections, and you can go see the original tree, which is probably pushing 90 years old at this point. Syringa Pekinensis, you may know reticulata, ivory silk. This is a very closely related species, and we really like this one for the strongly exfoliating bark. Has the, shall we say, aromatic flowers in June for us, as does Pekinensis. And then one that was actually pre-selected for us by Beijing Botanic Garden for more refined upright habit and kind of primrose yellow flowers, and was shared with the Morton Arboretum probably 12 or 13 years ago now, and we've gotten this one out in the trade. Doesn't have the exfoliating bark, but it still has a reasonable bark, good flowers, and good fall color, probably 3 out of 4 years. So numbers are still limited, but you can be watching for this one. To shrubs, Aronia, Molana, Carper. This is a dwarf form of it that was collected in Iroquois County in northern-ish Illinois. So it's a regional genotype for us, which has value for marketing purposes, of course. And here it is in full bloom. Doesn't get any taller than about 3 feet tall. Otherwise has those full-size blackish fruit in the fall that Molana carpa tends to have. Itea Virginica Morton. This was a collection from the southeast. It's not native up in our part of the woods, but they realized this 1950s wild collected plants. So there was one plant in the collection that wasn't turning chlorotic. Now I'm sure Itea for you guys must turn a lovely chartreuse color with your high pH here. But if you're on a pH of 7 to 7.5, you could consider doing this one instead of Henry's Garnet because it just doesn't get as chlorotic. If you're on an acid soil, there's no point growing ours. You might as well grow Henry's Garnet that's readily available in the trade. Similar habits and flower time and sequence and et cetera. To a dwarf, well, I won't say dwarf, a compact form of a native sumac. This is a male selection of one of several of our native sumacs. Is this species down here as well? I assume it must be. It comes through this part of the country as well. And this one tops out at 5 feet tall, whereas the species tends to get 10 to 15 feet tall. Good fall color, interesting kind of chartreuse-ish. There's a plant out of bloom. If it does get a little rangy, even at 5 feet, you can renewal prune it. Like all sumacs, it needs to go, of course, on a well-drained soil. And on our soils, it doesn't tend to run, but if you put it in a sandier or a looser loam soil, it'll, of course, behave like any other sumac. And it will go walkabout on you. Old plants, and it's interesting with woody plants how long older plants can kind of persist into the trade, though I think now with a lot of breeding going on, we'll start seeing churning in our industry just like the perennials are seeing now, like we're seeing with hydrangeas. And so we have 3 selections of Airwood viburnum that were all selected by Ralph Sinisfet, who was an unbelievable, had an great eye for plants when he ran Sinisfet Nursery back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so Chicago luster with its lustrous foliage. Northern Burgundy has the best fall color for us up north. It's more of a southern species, of course, and a lot of times I want to color up so late. Frost knocks the foliage off them before we get fall color, but this one's been effective for us. Then Autumn Jazz is one of those late coloring ones, but when it does color up for us, you get a nice melange of yellows to oranges and reds all in the same plant. And so surprisingly, despite as old as these introductions are, they're still out there. And I would think there's room to do more work with our native viburnums, certainly. Mike Annie, hopefully is a name known to some of you folks, Johnson's Nursery, Menominee Falls, southeast Wisconsin. Again, another nursery with a history of plant introductions, especially Mike Annie, who's worked there for decades now as a plant propagator and does breeding on the side. And so we have actually co-introduced one of his plants previously, and we'll co-introduce 2 more. The Redwood American Cranberry Bush. This one was actually wild collected in southern Wisconsin from a native population. And so we know certainly this is trilobum and not an opulus for those folks who want to insist on trilobum versus opulus. So the taxonomists all treat them as the same species now. Good fall color, good fruit set on this one. And in the spring, the new foliage coming out has this nice purple suffusion to them. Like a lot of the viburnums, though, if this is in a stressful habitat, it is beset with some of the modern problems. And so plant judiciously and accordingly. To one we're very excited about, and we just distributed budwood of this one to the West Coast 3 or 4 years ago now. It's a native, it's the Ohio Buckeye, but it's a selection that Mike selected out of a breeding program that's absolutely disease resistant, light fruit setting. I got too close to the other mic. See if turning that, there I toggled, did that do it? Yep. Oh, that's out there, it's them. I thought it was me. And reliable fall color, and this is fall coloring for us in early September. So it's really ahead of most of the other woody plants in the landscape. So I strongly encourage you to watch for availability. Johnson's Nursery has some available. Yes?
Did you turn the mic off?
I turned it back on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's back on. I thought that was me and I toggled it. We're back on. And then a spirea that Mike also selected that I must admit, we just picked this up last year, and I actually haven't seen it in landscape myself yet, but good bicolored flowers, good fall color, and a reasonably compact habit, about 3 feet by 3 feet. So there's a number of newer plants coming down the pipeline from the Morton Arboretum. Some will fly, some maybe won't. We've been trying to promote 2 selections of our native myrica, the Bayberry, that you make Bayberry candles from. It's actually that waxy bloom on the fruit on the right that you see there. They're actually dioecious plants like holly, separate male and female plants. But because you don't have an attractive flower on these, I think bayberries in general are a tough sell outside of the restoration and mitigation crowd. But we're going to continue to try to promote these, especially more on the East Coast where they're used more readily in those type of uses and habitats. Both the selections remain under 5 feet. And this is one we think is going to have a great future. That's a male Kentucky coffee tree, not quite fastigiate, but darn close to it. We think this will be a good American ash replacement, for instance. We're in year 5 now of ash tree replacement in the Chicago area, so it's really ripped through our area, and probably 2/3 of our ash trees are gone now. And so the municipal forests have learned their lesson between that and elms, the generation or 2 generations before, that diversity is key. And it's in Chicago, diversity is not even from street to street or city to city, but our neighborhood to neighborhood, but they even want it mixed up on a block and then a different mix on the next street over to try to avoid running into that issue again. The main limitation here will be propagation. We've taken root cuttings and have generated a few young plants that we're hoping now, as we have some juvenile stock, we can root those from cuttings, or else we'll end up having to bud them probably on seedling understock. We're still figuring that out. And then here's one you don't know. This is Corylus fargesii. Actually, I was involved in a collecting trip to China in 1996 that we brought this back from the Qinling Mountains in central China. This is a tree-form hazelnut. It's not, we didn't train this as a single stem. This is its natural habit. In fact, when we first walked up on them, we thought we were looking at our native river birch gone walkabout wild. We ran into another of our native plants escaped and invading in China. So the reverse does happen as well because this has a strong exfoliating bark on it. This has just been almost impossible to propagate like a lot of the other hazelnuts. And so we're still not sure how we'll get that into the trade. There's some hybrid carpinus, some with really nice fall colors, but these really are understory trees, and so nurseries used to grow a lot of understory azaleas and understory trees under big lath structures. That's just simply not done anymore, and so we're not sure how we'll get these into the trade, but we'll be working on those. I say meet Joe Rothleutner, the now ex-breeder at the Morton Arboretum. He was there 4 years, and then he's departed for another job. But they just, as of last week, hired another person to fill his shoes. So she'll be on board in October, and I feel very confident that not only all the breeding projects that he initiated will move forward, but also the propagation of some of these plants hiccuped for 1 year without somebody there to promote and push it through. And he has a 10-acre tree nursery. It makes me very jealous because I don't have any kind of space like that. The Morton certainly understands and strongly supports the breeding program there, which I appreciate and acknowledge. So my work at the Botanic Garden, I came on board in 1995 and initiated a breeding program even that first summer, kind of in borrowed space, and dabbled in the Richard Hockey's evaluation program, talking about taxa. He was already underway with evaluating, and so selected out better looking parents, and also tried to be aware I cannot compete head to head with a big breeding program, and so selected taxa that I didn't have to compete with the Terra Novas, et cetera. So I won't go through all this stuff out loud, but you can kind of mull through it. Mostly breeding with North American native taxa, mostly focusing on interspecific hybridization, which we'll talk about. But ultimately, we're trying to come up with clonal introductions, and so we have to also work out the propagation protocols, whether it's cuttings, tissue culture, simple division, and the like, root cuttings on one. Native plants, of course, we're all aware of this. This wave keeps rolling for us. It's certainly not going to go away, and so that's an opportunity for me to kind of tap into it. It's also just the diversity of germplasm especially. I can use cultivated forms of our native plants and use those as breeding stock, as well as I've done a lot of collecting of germplasm in the wild, which I'll just touch on briefly later in this presentation. And combining those two, wild types with selected materials, sometimes gives you very interesting results. As well as that presumably, at least doing this wild collections will give me adaptability to some of these pressures that can be brought to bear on our plants as we're breeding them. Okay. Interspecific hybridization is a bit of a tough nut to crack. It's crossing species within a genus, but if you're successful and you can take it to the second generation, that's where the fun stuff happens. Because the first generation often will be kind of intermediate in ornamental traits and hardiness and disease resistances, et cetera, to your two parents. And that's a very broad stroke I'm painting there. There's lots of exceptions, of course. But if you cross those first generation, the second generation is when everything busts loose and you run into all sorts of novel traits that just simply weren't there in the parents. And I'll show you examples of that. And so not only unique ornamental attributes, but you can actually get hardier plants, more salt-tolerant plants, et cetera, et cetera. Again, good environmental adaptability that I'm looking for in the breeding. And so I've done collecting as close as 3 miles away from the Botanic Garden in this really high-quality prairie that exists behind a post office that most people aren't aware of. And I've used some of the germplasm out of there. Good mesic tallgrass prairie. Which covered about 70% of northern Illinois pre-settlement. Now they're called corn and soybean fields. And Lytris spicata and Echinacea Paradoxa are both plants that I've dabbled with in the past, for instance, in the breeding. To sand prairies in northern Illinois. Now we're on the upwind side of Lake Michigan, and so we don't get the dramatic sand dunes that the state of Michigan does, because the sand blows onshore for them and offshore for us. But we have a very interesting kind of ecosystem there. And it's kind of fun to point this out. This is one of the places that Juniperus horizontalis is actually native in the United States. And we would go up there and see thousands of acres of horizontal juniper growing in pure sand. And this tends to be higher up on the sand dunes as well. It's not down in the swales, the moist spots. And so this is really telling, because for us where we grow, we often put these in flat beds and we mulch them and we water them, and then they have disease issues and die out, and we wonder what's wrong with the plant. Well, I don't think anything's wrong with the plant. I think we've just simply given it the wrong habitat. You guys know those stories. You've all run into them, of course. And so Baptisia was one of the first plants that I did breeding on using both selected material, and I also had to go wild collect because a lot of the species that I use simply weren't available at the time I initiated this work in 1996. Why Baptisia? Well, you can scan through that. And lots of species, lots of natural hybrids that I encountered in the taxonomy and ecology literature, which suggested to me that I could cross the different species. If you look at those flower colors, it's not a perfect analogy, but think of a painter having those colors and combining them in different concentrations. It really expands the palette. Adaptability, of course, is there. And when I started this, there was only one clone in the marketplace at that point, 1996, and that was Purple Smoke. And that was a chance seedling that somebody discovered in North Carolina. It wasn't an intentionally made cross. They certainly do have issues as well. Chlorosis and high pH with certain species. Some of the species are from high pH, and so use them accordingly. This is not so much a problem in the landscape because you'll never be aware of it, but this little weevil will find dense plantings of Baptisia and hang around till the next year. And so these really played havoc with my breeding program. It was one of the reasons I shut it down. We couldn't keep this beetle off from predating 90% of my hybrid seed. They drill into the fruit early in the season and they eat the seed out of the fruit, but the fruit still matures, and so you at least get that ornamental display. And every once in a while, have you guys seen up this way occasionally where a caterpillar chews a lot of the foliage on Baptisia? It's happened twice in 16 years. And this Genista broom moth typically is down in Texas. But when the moths are hatched in the spring, if there's a good strong southern wind for about 3 days, it can come north. Luckily it doesn't overwinter for us, but the years they do blow north, they can create a lot of just one season damage on your plants. And then the southern species, most of them just simply weren't well adaptable for me up north and dropped them from breeding. So these are the species I used. Let's see, Leucophea, Leucantha, Tinctoria are native where I am. Sphaerocarpa is native in Arkansas and Texas. but proved perfectly hardy. Our Australis is native from southern Illinois all the way down into central Texas, and I used genotypes from both ends of the range because they were very valuable in their own right, and even the southern forms proved hardy. And I had about 6 other species I didn't use. I also had the chance to go see some of the natural hybrids, including this population in northern Indiana that was described in the 1920s as a cross between Leucantha and Tinctoria, and that original population is still there all these years later. And so we figured out, how do you keep the insects off? We tried these pollination bags. An August rain, windstorm, broke every stem. Back to the drawing board. Ultimately, I thought about who's the pollinators on these, and it's mostly carpenter bees and bumblebees, and indeed the queens do most of the foraging. That I realized they're focused on the morphology of that big pea flower. If I pull that petal and those 2 petals off, if I pull 3 of the 5 petals off, the bee no longer recognizes the flower, completely ignored them. And I could do my emasculation and pollination, pull the anthers out so they wouldn't self-pollinate, and never had to worry about bagging them after that. It took me about 3 years to figure that simple out. Seed ripens in August, September, cross depending. Worked on propagation. We also worked on cuttings because at that time it was very difficult to overwinter rooted cuttings of Baptisia. The key, if you're doing Baptisia at all, is that when you take those cuttings, take them as early in the season as you can. Typically for us it's about mid-June, and ensure that you use a deep cell tray or deep pot like an SVD2 and put at least 1, if not 2, nodes into that rooting medium, and make sure it's an unbranched node, namely that axillary bud hasn't started growing. That's what overwinters for you. If you just stick internode tissue in like you're rooting a coleus, you'll get a great root system, but nothing overwinters and you have nobody home the following spring. And so we had at one point about 350 hybrid Baptisia in the field. We had a Baptisia field day of garden writers, amateur gardeners, nursery folks. We gave everybody 5 flags, and I said, number 1 to 5, go mark your 5 favorite plants. Don't follow Roy Clem around, who's our big plant guru in our area. I want your own opinions. And then we argued for about 3 hours about which plants to introduce. But it was a fun exercise. Basically, the folks who knew Baptisia didn't want the odd colors. And for the average gardener and garden writer, it was the novel colors that attracted them the most because they could think outside the box. And so we mixed it up. So Twilight was our first one we introduced. This is a Baptisia on steroids. The original plant, when I had to reluctantly remove it 2 years ago, was 5 feet tall by 9.5 feet wide. That's a lot of herbaceous perennial, folks, and the root system was monstrous. Starlight, second introduction, much more behaved, 3 foot by 3 foot 1 with really large, oversized pea flowers. Midnight with more elongated inflorescences and a tiny little bit of a repeat bloom. We won't talk about that here, but it's almost impossible to program in. Solar flare, and you can see the parentage is getting more complicated. I've actually had hybrids up to 5 different species and still be fertile. And so I think you could basically take those 12 species and combine them in any combination you really want to. And then newer ones that are just coming out now. This is a straight up Australis that we crossed the southern form with the northern form and got a more behaved plant habit-wise, but with good flower power. And then here we are really starting to push the color on some of these. Lavender rose, royal purple, an early blooming one, low growing, and very floriferous, sunny morning. And the stems are also gray in the spring, kind of a purple gray. Another early one, more upright habit than the previous one, similar color, a little lighter yellow. And then the sandstorm, kind of an odd when you get up close. The flowers are kind of a yellow tan color. Not sure this is going to make it in the marketplace, but some folks want us to really float out some unusual ones. Really try to focus on the habit as well. Spilled buttermilk, if you know Leucophea, our prairie species that has, it's the only northern one that has horizontal inflorescences. And so I try to come up with a more vigorous form of that with the horizontal flowers. I think we succeeded. And then this is the fun thing about interspecific hybridization, lunar eclipse. You saw a solar flare go by, and then this is actually across the solar flare out to even another species, so a 5-species hybrid. And as we get closer to the flowers, they age. Here's the younger flowers, and they open this kind of white color, and then as they get older, they go medium and then dark violet. None of the species do this. And so this is just a novel trait that came out simply by combining these different species together. I originally wanted to get a bicolor flower like a lupin, never saw one. But if somebody continues to breed with this, they might come up with all sorts of novel color transitions instead. Quite dramatic. Echinacea, I'll talk briefly about that, but I want to point something out. We were actually the troublemakers. We had the first of one of these in the marketplace, and who knew the firestorm that was going to start, the orange meadow bright? I had no idea. I really didn't. And I don't have actually a photograph of the F1 hybrids, but the trick to getting all these oranges and yellows is to take Echinacea purpurea alba, the white flowered form, cross it with Echinacea Paradoxa. The first generation, everybody's light pink. And you might almost say, well, that doesn't look like anything. But I thought when we took it to the second generation, we might get something interesting. And that's the year we bloomed about 450 F2 hybrids. And oh my, and the fragrance. Neither of the parents were fragrance, and this just has a strong citrus honey fragrance that just wafted probably 100 feet from this bed. And so that's actually where it all started. We're all aware of the adaptability issues of these plants, and I'm going to tell you why, if you haven't already figured out. Echinacea Paradoxa is from the Ozarks. It's mostly in Missouri, and I think some in Arkansas. May come in the westernmost Kentucky and Tennessee, not sure. It's found in limestone glades where it's native, and here's a photograph of it in the wild in Missouri. Well, think about that. It's just like the limestone here. The pH is high, nutrient availability is low. The limestone there is probably like limestone here. It's a very porous limestone, and Echinacea Paradoxa tends to have kind of a taproot-like system that basically has one heavy root that goes down into a rock crevice. And so what do? We put this in a soilless mix, we water it, we fertilize it, we put it in the garden, we put mulch down, maybe we throw a handful of fertilizer around. It's one of the reasons a lot of these just have been short-lived in that we have poor adaptability issues. I think as we breed further in away from the wild type on this, we'll ultimately whip that, but it really is still causing, I think, a lot of adaptability. So enough of that. I'm done breeding them. I can't compete with the Terra Nova's 20 plants a year. I hang my hat on phlox breeding these days, mostly the spring blooming phlox. And so with any of my trials, it's basically initially bringing in every commercial cultivar I can get my hand on that I think will have interesting traits and or adaptability where we are. And so you tend to do a lot of broad screening early on for 2 or 3 years just to figure out who the good plants are if you don't already know. And then I've wild collected. Phlox bifida is native here in the Midwest. In our neck of the woods, it's found basically on pure sand. Down here, it grows on limestone outcrops. And unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to come south and collect off limestone yet, because I'm sure it would have a tremendous difference in adaptability and ornamental issues. But I've used plants from this population in northern Indiana. Right next to the highway, the mower mows just above it and knocks down all the competition. And I've never seen a population of Phlox bifida bigger than this one that's mower maintained. How's that? It gives me an opportunity to go places out west. It's rough, somebody has to do it. The Gravelly Range in Montana, I'm up at about 9,600 foot elevation, and you're looking at about 40 miles of rolling hills like this with different rock types and 3 or 4 different species of phlox I've been chasing after, including this one, Phlox multiflora. Large flowers, and they're fragrant. And if I could cross this with Phlox subulata and get some fragrance into it, that would be fantastic. Haven't succeeded yet, but I've been using another western species that has real high salt tolerance. In fact, grows in very saline habitats out west. And I am getting hybrids from that I hope will give us good salt tolerance in a subulata type. And so I have been able to make interspecific hybrids, as you see here. Each of those is a seedling, and trying to decide which ones to go with for trials. We'll propagate 20 to 24 plants. I'll put those out for a minimum of 2 to 3 years. More often 4 to 5 years of trials in-house, and also comparing the equivalent commercial cultivars before we decide to distribute it to our licensed nurseries, who then give it a second layer of trials. And so from that first cross to when the plant's at the retail level, even with an herbaceous perennial, typically 7 to 10 years is not out of question. It's a long-term thing. So the first one we introduced was actually an early summer blooming Phlox glaberrima selection. We're calling that one Forever Pink. Stays compact, about 12 inches tall. Good flower coverage. I did a Phlox procumbens, which is subulata by stolonifera. This is proving to be better adapted further south than in zones 4 and 5, borderline hardy. It's going to be more a zone 6, zone 7 plant. And then this is my first east-west hybrid, crossing Phlox bifida you saw earlier with a selection of Phlox kelsey that's found in Montana and Idaho. You typically find it in habitats where it's right on the edge of very, very salty water. And sometimes I've even seen a salt crust growing around these plants. So imagine the adaptability of that. Pink parasol, possibly available next year. It's been with the nurseries 2 years now. This is an east by east combination. And then running with scissors, we distributed last year as well, possibly available next year. Oversized flowers, about 1.25 inches along. It's running by scissors, I heard somebody whisper. Remember those little kindergarten slip scissors with the blunt tips? Well, if you looked up close at the flowers of this, it looks just like that. My daughter kept asking me to name a plant after her. Well, I couldn't name one after her at work, but I thought she really liked this because she was a terror with those scissors and kept cutting up everything. So she thought it was adorable. And then this is one of the interesting traits that come out of these interspecific hybrids. This is another east-west cross of subulata by that kelsey that you saw earlier. And it didn't really dawn on me because I'm used to the subulatas where the flowers tend to more often not fade as they get older. And I finally, looked close, that the darker flowers are actually the older flowers. And so as they get older, they continue to get darker. So we've been focusing on trying to select plants that look good when the flowers first open and they're all one color, when they're at the intermediate stage like this, and then late in the bloom when they tend to all be the same color as well. And if they're attractive all 3 times, let's put it out there. So we just distributed this one this year, probably 2 years before it's available. We've also co-introduced plants with some local backyard breeders and nurseries. Polygonatum Prince Charming. You know, you can have a large breeding program like we have, but I mentioned this one, of course, just to give credit where credit is due. But also Brent does a lot of breeding, but often it's just by planting parent plants side by side and collecting the seed off them open pollinated. And that's how this came about, was seed he collected off of a small patch of Solomon seals he had, and he got some hybrids out of it, and we introduced this one. Of course, we don't know who the parents were as a result, but that's okay. To Schizocarium scoparium carousel, there's actually a plant in a pot at one of the nurseries out here at the booths behind us. And Don Beam at Beam's Garden Center in Rushville just went out and wild collected seed, grew out a few dozen seedlings, and made this one selection as the most compact one in the group that didn't lodge. Good color on the plant during the spring, summer, and fall as well. It's been doing well for us. Don't always weed your gardens, folks, because this introduction of ours actually appeared as a seedling in our trials of stackies at the Botanic Garden. We could have easily pulled it out, and some nurseryman visiting one day said, "You've got a really nice seedling over here. Are you watching that?" And we went from there and introduced it. So, to more formal crosses, I played for a time with Veronica as we introduced Tidal Pool a few years ago. I really meant this more for Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas type habitats. It's from drier plants. To this introduction with a local nursery, this arose as a branch sport. A lot of you probably know Veronica Waterperry Blue. It's been around a long time. And this was simply a mutation in tissue culture, well, not in tissue culture, in rooting. That John happened to notice that one of the plugs in one of his propagation trays had white flowers. He pulled it out. He propagated from it 3 times to make sure it was stable. Gave it to me. I propagated 500 of them, and they all proved white flowered, and so we put it out there in the trade. And it's actually going past Waterperry Blue now in popularity, because those blue flowers you can't see from very far away, but these white flowers on this you can see from a long distance over. To a sneak preview, I'm just distributing this one for the first time to our nurseries in a couple of weeks. I selected this panicum for real dense inflorescences because we need more selections of our native grasses that kind of supplant miscanthus and some of the other non-natives. We'll never get those beautiful colors of the miscanthus inflorescences, but this might be a step in that direction. And I'm calling it a bad hair day because on a windy day, the massive inflorescences on this do flop all over the place. That has topped out at about 6 feet of height and 3 feet width in 4-year-old plant. So it's not going to be a Dallas Blues type monster switchgrass. More are coming. You can go to our website to look up our information. We're small. It's me and the breeder at the Morton Arboretum, and I got an administrative assistant a day a week, so be patient with us. We have a lot of hats to wear, but if you have questions, get back to us. You are welcome as members of the industry. If you can use any of the images from our website, don't email me, just download it and use them. Our plant release bulletins are all electronically available from our website as well as downloads. And I certainly have to do a shout out to our 120 licensed nurseries, and especially the guys on the West Coast that are doing the heavy lifting on all the woody plants and getting them propagated and out to you. And I thank you.